You found the skeleton. How would you tell it to represent? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. I never really expected to cover today's creationist, mostly because I didn't really know he was an anti-evolutionist. As I'm sure you know, since you clicked on this video, the man of the hour is Frank Turek. Turek is primarily known for his Christian apologetics and is a somewhat controversial figure, to put it mildly. While most of his arguments, such as the cosmological argument, are outside the scope of this channel, and my own area of knowledge, I hadn't really planned to cover him, but then I found a video of his called Intelligent Design and Evolution. With a title like that, I couldn't let it go. Unfortunately, this video was apparently filmed on a potato and came in the amazingly awful resolution of 320 by 240, a resolution similar to that of the first ever webcams. In an effort to make this video watchable at 1920 by 1080, my normal resolution, I have put him on an old CRT TV and have just filmed that, being careful to match my frame rate to his 29.97 frames per second to avoid flickering and strobing. Before we start, if you would like this video, I'd greatly appreciate it. YouTube has not been kind to me when it comes to putting my videos in front of eyeballs, even those of my subscribers, and liking this video really helps with that. Well, let's dive in, shall we? Well, that was painfully 90s/early 2000s. I kind of expect at least a Frank school planner to jump out at me, or for my old Vampire the Masquerade dice to reappear from being lost so I can spend some vitae on keeping my breath warm on a cold night, all while I'm listening to the theme song for Power Rangers Lost Galaxy or Star Trek Deep Space Nine. As for the questions asked, does truth exist? Yes, there are indeed things that are true. Does God exist? I'm not here to answer that question. Are miracles possible? That's a malformed question, and both the supernatural and miracles tend to be notoriously poorly defined, so I'm not even sure the question is meaningful without much more context. Is the New Testament true? Well, that depends. Certain things in the New Testament are verifiably true, such as the existence of characters such as Pontius Pilate and Herod Antipas. Some of it is definitely not true, such as the slaughter of the innocents or the census where everyone had to go back to his ancestral city, thereby ruining the whole point of a census. A lot of it is in the probably true to maybe true category, like the Council of Jerusalem. Like virtually all works from the ancient past and antiquity, the books of the New Testament are neither rigorous works of history, nor simply all just made-up nonsense.
There's a common misconception in the general public that science is the bearer of all truth.
Is there, though? That's the philosophical position of scientism, and I'm not sure I've ever actually heard of anyone who truly adopts that position. Most people are happy to say that things like mathematics, history, and philosophy can also get us to knowledge. That is, things we believe in for good reason and that are true. Science is certainly a powerful way to gain knowledge, and it is one of the most reliable ways, since it has at its core the idea of testing, not just to see if you're right, but more importantly, testing to see if you're wrong.
And that whatever scientists say really is so.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but given the wild success of science in virtually every field to which it can be and has been applied, the rigor which normally characterizes the research, and the collective millennia of expertise in current experts, when a field reaches a strong consensus, it represents the best available explanation of the facts involved in that consensus. It's possible that this consensus is wrong, but until such time as it is demonstrated, the safe bet is to accept the consensus. This includes on things like the fact that chiropractic is basically a scam, and that climate change is very real and overwhelmingly driven by humans.
I'd like to talk today about this issue of science, particularly science doesn't say anything, scientists do.
Strictly speaking, this is literally true. Science isn't an active agent that can generally be the subject of a transitive verb in a literally correct statement, with a few exceptions. But that being said, there are still things that are absolutely not compatible with the data in science, and so science precludes those things. Vaccines don't cause autism. Separate ancestry for life forms so far known on Earth isn't true. Volcanoes or the sun being the driver of climate change isn't true. The Earth being a giant space pizza isn't true. The flood of Noah isn't true, at least not as a worldwide flood. The data absolutely preclude these things. And when scientists tell you that, griping about the lack of agency of science as a concept won't help you any.
What they're finding is that ever since about 1980, there's been an increase in scientists going beyond the data. They are politicizing the data.
Who is this they? Is they Breitbart? Is it Fox News? It doesn't really matter. Scientists are allowed to advocate for political action and have science be a part of their reasoning. If you're in medical science and you know that a certain policy causes negative health outcomes for a significant part of the population, why wouldn't you advocate against such policies? If you're an ecologist, why wouldn't you advocate for better environmental protection regulation? Scientists are people too. They have interests, passions, friends, and families. They are not simple neutral arbiters of the data, at least not outside their actual peer-reviewed publications. I personally think that we could stand more science in politics, not less. Science is a big part of the reason that harmful things like cigarettes and conversion therapy are now heavily regulated and banned in various places. I have trouble seeing how that is not a good thing. It was science that both identified the hole in the ozone layer and got it fixed via international political action.
They are saying things like, science says we must, science says we should, science tells us we must, science tells us we should, science commands, science requires, science dictates, science compels.
Oh no! Humans anthropomorphizing something!
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Look at this, coming up to this current year, 2010. The one that is, it looks like the most prevalent is this idea, oh, that's the total. Science tells us we should.
So the biggest example of this is the one that, of those listed, has the least rhetorical force. If anything, scientists should be more active in giving people evidence-based advice within their areas of expertise. Although I will say they might want to shut up more about areas outside of their areas of expertise, as that can go badly wrong. If you want more information, look up the phrase Nobel disease when you're done with this video.
Science doesn't say anything.
Why do so many creationists not understand anthropomorphization? This is something I'm pretty sure I learned about in, 6th grade. It's just the imparting of human-like characteristics to non-human entities, especially inanimate or conceptual entities, by way of an analogy, to make communication easier or more evocative. No one is ascribing actual agency and political advocacy to science per se. They just don't want to have to say, the data strongly indicate that in order to maximally fulfill the goal under consideration, we ought to do so-and-so, or the equivalent.
Scientists, we have to interpret the data and make an interpretation from that point.
Yeah, and when all your data point to a particular direction, there's only so much interpreter freedom you have. For instance, all the data indicate that the climate is warming more or less in lockstep with the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that humans are by far the largest contributors to the increase in carbon dioxide in the last few centuries. So, there really are no valid interpretations that don't involve human activity as the current driver of climate trends. You can quibble about things like the exact contribution of non-human sources of carbon, and the results of climate change, and the likely future outcomes of climate change, but you can't honestly look at the data and support a conclusion that humans are having no effect, and that burning as much coal as possible won't exacerbate things.
But these individuals are getting authoritative, as if there's some sort of
Expert? Because, they literally are experts?
cosmic science god out there.
I'm lucky my eyes don't really have all that much in the way of mobility, because if they did, they'd have just rolled all the way to face the back of my skull, severing my optic nerve as it pulls apart from too much tension. I can see why people hate this guy.
Who tells us how we're supposed to live. In other words, it's gotten moralistic and politicized.
Imagine thinking that knowing verifiable things about how the world works wouldn't have moral or political implications. How would that even work? The only way to take actions that are political or moral is with some kind of expectation of the outcome of your actions. For example, let's say you were offered $1 million US. You don't have to do anything but accept the money, and it will be direct deposited into the US bank account of your choosing, and if you do not have such an account, the equivalent amount will be deposited into an account of your choosing in your country of residence. That seems like a perfectly moral thing to do. You're not being asked to do anything bad. But, as I'm sure many of you have seen coming, what if right before you decide to accept this offer, you're told that some random human somewhere will be instantly killed if you accept this money, for no other reason than that you have done so? Suddenly, what otherwise seemed like a perfectly acceptable thing to do no longer seems that way. Another example is that generally a person cutting open another person and taking bits out would be considered a horrible crime. But in the context of a surgery, it's perfectly fine and perhaps even praiseworthy. What is the difference in the moral standing in these examples? It is the knowledge of consequences. In the first place, you will be better off most likely with the money, but the expense to another person will be incalculable. And knowing that, Accepting the money makes you responsible. In the second case, the surgeon knows that what he is doing will more likely do good than harm. Science makes us better at knowing the consequences of our actions. It's why we try not to allow things like dumping toxic waste in rivers, and why we have slowed carbon emissions, although not nearly enough. Science informs politics specifically because it answers the question of what will happen if people do various actions. If you favor certain outcomes for society that can be influenced by public policy, why would you not advocate for policies designed to bring about those outcomes based on science, which will inform you what those policies are?
As I mentioned to you yesterday, I had an atheist at A&M, a biology student, who after the seminar, during the Q&A, we were going back and forth, and I finally said to him, I said, what is the origin of information?
That has no single answer and depends heavily on your definition of information and which information you're talking about. But under the definition used in information theory, the aspect of science that deals with information from a statistical standpoint, it can be literally anything that varies from a pulsar to an earthquake to a novel.
Information itself. And he said, that's not my field.
Well, given that information theory isn't biology, he was probably right, but I'll note that it's also not Turek's field.
I said, that's exactly the problem. You can't grant yourself information, and then once you grant yourself all these impossibilities, it seems, then take your worldview from that point up and say everything fits.
Why not? All logical reasoning has to start from some basic premises that are not evidenced or argued for. Now, don't get me wrong, you can make an argument that an assumption like this isn't properly basic and should be argued for, but Turek doesn't seem to be doing this. Further, if the reason you take something as an assumption without yourself delving into it is simply that everyone who has checked has more or less come to the same conclusion, with the only exceptions being kooks with motivated reasoning, then I'd say that's probably sufficient for most purposes.
No, you've got to explain all the data, not just the data in your little worldview.
No, I don't. That's insanely unreasonable. I literally don't have the ability or time to do that. Neither does anyone else. You have to pick and choose the things you're going to investigate.
We're not finding unity and diversity anymore as we used to at universities. We're staying in our own little narrow worldview. We don't understand philosophy anymore. We don't understand how these other disciplines impact the whole overall rubric of truth. We don't understand that. We zero in on this one little thing and we miss the big picture.
No, instead, scientists with different areas of expertise collaborate when there's overlap between their fields. Most of biology doesn't really overlap with information theory. Genetics tends to, but that's only part of biology, and even then it doesn't always. Most biologists will in no way benefit from knowing a bunch of stuff about Shannon information or signal entropy and whatnot. If Frank has a particular aspect of biology that he thinks would be improved by a wider appreciation of information science among those biologists who study it, he is welcome to make his case, but just blanket complaints about the fact that people have specialties and tend not to pontificate outside of their areas of expertise is just him whining.
So what about DNA similarity? Well, let's talk about it. We do have common DNA among different creatures.
Importantly, we have common DNA that forms a nested hierarchy that largely matches that taken from morphology, although not in all cases. Even more significantly, we have the same nesting pattern in non-conserved DNA, which completely negates the possibility of separate ancestry. But I'll let Frank cook a bit.
And it is true that DNA similarity is about 96% between apes and humans, but you know it's also about 90% between mice and humans.
Well, yeah, rodents being mice are in the Glider clade, which includes lagomorphs, the bunnies and friends. It's the sister group to Euarchonta, which is the group that includes primates and colugos. We would expect mice to share a lot of DNA with primates in general, which would include humans.
In fact, because of the complex ways cells use genetic information, very small genetic differences can produce big functional differences.
Hence why mutation can easily lead to evolution. A relatively small mutation in terms of actual difference in the genome can lead to significant changes in the morphology or biochemistry of an organism. I thought Frank was trying to argue against evolution, not for it. Was I misled?
But that's not even the main point.
I mean, evolution mostly boils down to mutation, selection, and drift, so I'd argue it's at least one of the main points.
I mean, it could be 99% us and apes, 99.999, whatever you want to call it, and that wouldn't necessarily mean we had a common ancestor. Why not?
That's the thing, though. It rather would. At the very basic level, your genome comes from your ancestors. While horizontal gene transfer is a thing, it's fairly uncommon among things like complex multicellular animals, so we can mostly ignore it for now. Paternity tests rely on the fact that DNA similarity indicates genetic descent. So does using partial matches in forensics testing to identify the family members of a suspect. So too does scientific testing of various populations to determine things like mitochondrial or Y chromosome haplotypes. But we can go outside of a single species and see the genetic similarity with now extinct species of humans, such as Neanderthals or Denisovans. So where does this stop? Is DNA testing sufficient to demonstrate father-child relationships, but not cousin relationships? Is it okay for testing the genetic descent of different groups of people, like the natives of the Canary Islands and their connection to the native people of North Africa? Or the genetic link between Native Americans and the natives of Siberia? Can we demonstrate the genetic link between Homo sapiens and H. neanderthalensis? If it can do these things, then it just as well demonstrates the common ancestry of Homo sapiens and Pan troglodytes, or H. sapiens and Mus domesticus, or even the common ancestry of Elephas maximus and Penis glabra. If you want to argue otherwise, you have to show how we can tell where the indications of common ancestry become unreliable and why. You can't simply decide that because humans are the special boys of creation, that even greater similarities between them and chimps compared to, say, lions and tigers don't indicate common ancestry, even though most creationists think that lions and tigers do share common ancestry. So far, no reasons have been given that don't just boil down to post hoc excuses to keep humans special, and in some cases, to keep the number of animals on Noah's big boat down to a number that doesn't seem completely insane, just regular old partially insane.
Because DNA similarity could be evidence of a common designer rather than a common ancestor.
The problem is that in this case, we couldn't get a nested hierarchy and neutral variation, but we do. And we should expect to see things like common ecology and niche indicate high degrees of genetic similarity, but that is not the case. Common design would seem to predict that a dolphin and a shark should be more closely related than a dolphin and a moose. In fact, the dolphin and the moose are far more closely related. So on every testable front, separate ancestry fails in every novel prediction it makes.
Similar structures often have a similar blueprint.
Which, to be fair, is a prediction of design, based on how we see intelligent agents designing things. But then, what about when they don't? We have 4 lineages of truly flying animals: insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats. They all have very different wings. Why is that? Well, common design wouldn't predict that, with the possible exception of insects, given their vastly different size in most cases compared to most vertebrate flyers. But the difference between bat wings, pterosaurs, and bird wings is not predicted by common design. Instead, it is predicted by the fact that evolution is heavily contingent and cannot grab traits from outside of a lineage and port them over to another lineage, unlike an intelligent designer. Intelligent design predicts chimeras. Evolution predicts that we should not see such organisms. Evolution is winning this prediction competition by miles, or I guess 1.6 times as many kilometers for those of you who aren't Americans.
Have you guys ever seen this illustration? Have you seen this picture? Darwinist Tim Barra put it out.
I feel like he might not self-identify as a Darwinist.
He offered the progression of the Corvette as evidence of descent with modification.
No, he didn't. He offered it as an analogy, a way to help people understand gradualistic change through relatively minor modifications. He didn't use it as evidence. He didn't say to people, you see, because cars change over time, so do living things. I personally think it's a dumb analogy because cars don't reproduce, and they don't get their shape and internal configuration from the cars that went before them. 2 cars that roll off a factory floor one after the other aren't related at all, even if they're identical, because cars don't have genetic material that's passed from parent car to offspring car.
Look at the 1953 Corvette and the 1963, then up to the 1968, and then the 1978. You can see the progression there.
That's true.
That's evolution right there, baby.
No, it's because, again, there's no genetic descent with modification. It's just gradual change, but via a very different mechanism.
What's the problem with the illustration?
Everything I've been saying.
Yes! It's now known as Barra's blunder because this is evidence of intelligent design.
I've never heard of it being called that, and other than the University of New Mexico, every source I've seen referring to it as such is a creationist source, including, but not limited to, Evolution News, the Institute for Creation Research, Uncommon Descent, and Reasons to Believe. Anytime a term is virtually unheard of outside of pseudoscience outlets, you should be wary of it. Further, it's not evidence of intelligent design, because there was never a question of whether cars are intelligently designed, and because cars are produced in a fundamentally different way than living things that does not involve genetic descent. It doesn't do anything to demonstrate intelligent design in living things either, because living things and cars are not analogous in any way that matters to the question.
There's intelligent designers who did this. In fact, when Dr. Geisler had his debate with Paul Kurtz a number of years ago on the John Ankerberg show.
Does anyone in my audience even remember the John Ankerberg show?
Kurtz offered an illustration from the Wright brothers plane to the modern Boeing 747. And Geisler said, but who did that?
This is why I hate using things that don't have any genetic ancestry as an analogy for things that do. And the thing is that there are things with genetic ancestry that are not living things, like ancient texts such as the Bible or languages. In these cases, not only are there variations in a nested hierarchy, but they can be used to reconstruct the ancestor states. And further, we happen to know that in at least most cases, the changes in these things were not the result of intelligent agency intending them to change, although in the case of texts, that did occur, making them not as good an analogy as languages, but rather in virtually all cases the changes came about accidentally, without anyone willing it to be so. No one woke up one day and decided that they should really stop pronouncing most word-final consonants in French, or that they really wanted to do a great vowel shift in English.
That was done by intelligent designers, not some random process.
Something that was never in dispute.
And he kept persisting with the illustration, and Geisler finally said, stop using that, you're helping my argument. Because he was.
Only because Geisler had to pretend that an analogy was actually a model. Basically, in order for this to help creationism, rather than just being mostly useless to either side, the creationists have to lie about what the point of the admittedly dumb analogy is, or even that it's proposed as an analogy, rather than as evidence or as a model.
Go ahead, Greg.
Just an insertion that goes back to something that we talked about yesterday in argumentation here. Strictly speaking, this is not evidence for design, nor was it evidence for evolution. It is merely an illustration. Illustrations aren't evidence.
Thanks to Greg Kugel, he's right about this. He is in fact another Christian apologist. I'm curious to see how Turek will take having his whole point from the last few minutes kind of demolished in one sentence from fellow apologists.
So when Barra puts this up, illustrating natural progression, he is using a designed thing to illustrate, allegedly, a natural progression. So he's using the wrong kind of illustration, and really it's an illustration of design, not evidence of design, but an illustration of design. But it underscores the point that illustrations are not arguments.
Agreed. Is Kugel even an anti-evolutionist? Yep, turns out he is. Maybe I'll have to cover him. Based on this, he seems to be a cut above Turek at the very least.
There is no evidence of any kind in this picture. All it is showing is a picture of a concept.
Okay, I appreciate the concept, but we can move on.
But it passes in the minds of many as evidence because you can give a powerful illustration. So keep this in mind. Again, I'm going to underscore what I said yesterday. Alternate explanations are not arguments, and all illustrations are sophisticated alternate explanations. Just because they can illustrate the point powerfully doesn't mean they've given powerful evidence for the point being illustrated.
How many times can one apologist repeat himself without adding to the discussion at all?
Let's go back to our question. Is Barra just seeing what he wants to see?
So no acknowledgement from Turek that he was just badly wrong about this being used as evidence, and the fact that he himself claimed it was evidence. Cool.
Of course! And that's a great point, Greg. It's not evidence, it's an illustration.
Finally. Also, that means that it's not evidence for intelligent design of organisms either.
Is he seeing what he wants to see? That's what he's seeing.
No, he's just making a bad analogy. It happens to basically everyone.
He's just seeing what he wants to see. Also, with regard to DNA similarity, Darwinists must explain the vast dissimilarity between living things. They have to explain how the bee, the octopus, the Venus flytrap, mildew, peacock, the porcupine, and the human are all somehow related by some sort of natural process without intelligence.
That's literally what evolution is. When genes stop being exchanged between populations, then mutations in one lineage can't be passed on to members of the other lineage. And so each lineage accumulates mutations that become more and more different. Like, this is one of the most basic aspects of evolution. The whole point of evolution is to explain the origin of biodiversity. That means why organisms are similar and also why they are different. Because that's what diversity is. Having stuff that's not the same.
Look at the dissimilarity, not just the similarity.
Agreed. Look at it. That's the point I've already made. The dissimilarity is just as important, and it supports common descent just as much, and is in the same basic pattern. Does Turek think that biologists are under the impression that all organisms are essentially identical?
Notice that one of the main arguments here, the main arguments that they're bringing forth is called homology.
It's a main argument. I'm not sure I'd say it's the main argument.
Similarity. Well, that is an equally good argument for a common designer.
Except that it's not, though, because the pattern of homology and analogy isn't predicted by a common designer, but it is predicted by evolution. Common design should predict that homology will align more closely with the ecological needs of an organism than with anything else, but it simply does not. Birds and bats fly with very different wings. Different Antarctic fish use entirely different chemical means to keep ice crystals from forming in their cells. Platypus and snakes both produce neurotoxin, but despite similar method of action, they are completely different. The pattern of evident morphological homologies lines up with the genetics and the fossil record of organisms far better than it lines up with the actual needs of those organisms, meaning that disparate organisms that have superficially similar adaptations end up having different underlying anatomy and genetics, the exact thing common design does not predict, but which evolution does.
In other words, it's a wash here. They don't get anywhere with this.
No.
With this assertion. They're interpreting the evidence.
That jump cut is in the original. I didn't add it.
That it's common ancestry when it could easily be interpreted as common design. Doesn't get anyone anywhere to talk about similarity.
Except that no, the pattern of homology and analogy follow a nested hierarchy. The only times I've seen design things fall into a nested hierarchy is when one of the design goals is to mimic not design processes, like evolution or historical linguistics. For example, Tolkien devised several elven languages used in Middle-earth, more than just the ones you get samples of in The Lord of the Rings. They fit into a nested hierarchy specifically because he wanted his languages to seem like a real language family, something that isn't designed. Similarly, in speculative evolution, the whole point is for the organisms to look like they were not designed, so they too fall into nested hierarchies. But when you come to things where that isn't a design goal, such as mythical monsters, tools, vehicles, etc., you don't find a nested hierarchy. Sure, you can classify such things, such as into coupes, sedans, hatchbacks, trucks, etc., but someone else can come along and classify them by engine type, whether it be V4 or V6 or V8 or whatever. There's no objectively better way to do it, just subjective preference. But when it comes to classifying things like languages and organisms, there is an objective hierarchy that exists, and can be recovered using rigorous data-driven statistical means. That means that this classification isn't something arbitrarily imposed by humans, but actually reflects an underlying reality. That's important. The hierarchy isn't simply a social convention. It's not simply a tradition in biology. It's an objective thing. Now, what we call different parts of the hierarchy is arbitrary, but that does not negate that the hierarchy objectively exists.
How different would we need to be in order for them to say, we're too different to have been related?
That's pretty simple. If there were no actual homologies, but only analogies, it would be a great start. If the handedness of some biomolecules in humans were different than in other life, that would be another great indication. If the genetic code functioned differently, for instance, instead of having codons of 3 nucleotides, if humans use codons of 4, or use codons of length 3 but with a different codon assignment, if the neutral variation in humans had no correlation outside of humans, with, for example, apes, or other monkeys, rodents, etc., any of these things would throw a big wrench into the idea of common ancestry of humans and other organisms.
Well, I think an octopus is a lot different from a Venus flytrap.
Yeah, no one is going to disagree with you there, but they still have conserved eukaryote genes that are missing in archaeans, and they have conserved genes with archaeans that are missing in bacteria, meaning that these differences and also the similarities are what you'd expect from them sharing a common ancestor. A common ancestor which, by the way, not only wasn't an octopus or a Venus flytrap, but wasn't even an animal or a plant. It wasn't even multicellular.
Right? Mildew is a lot different from a porcupine.
True, although in fact being a fungus and therefore opisthecons, mildew is a whole lot more like a porcupine and an octopus than either is like a Venus flytrap. Indeed, genetic studies put the common ancestor of a porcupine and a Venus flytrap at about 2.2 billion years ago, as opposed to the common ancestor of mildew and a porcupine at about 1.3 billion years ago. You can see this even in the biochemistry of fungus, which rather than building cell walls from cellulose like plants, uses chitin, the same protein that makes up insect shells. Also, the digestive enzymes of fungi are similar to those of animals, and both are heterotrophs, as opposed to the autotrophic plants. See, it's the pattern of both similarity and difference that matters. Yes, mildew is extremely different from a porcupine, but they share more in common with each other than either does with any plant, and this is also confirmed in the genetics of fungi, plants, and animals.
But they're saying, oh no, they're all related.
Yes, because there is enormous evidence that that's true, and none that it's not. And there is counter-evidence to the idea of separate ancestry. We have good reason to accept eukaryote common ancestry, no reason to reject it, and no reason to accept eukaryote separate ancestry, and good reason to reject it. The clear winner is common ancestry.
You know, there's hardly anything written on about plant evolution.
That's weird because a Google Scholar search for plant evolution turned up about 6 million results. On the other hand, animal evolution turned up only 5,890,000. Granted, a bunch of that wouldn't have been written when Turek made his claim, but when I restricted the results to those written between 1800 and 2000, I get for plants 67,200 and for animals 28,100. If anything, plants seem to be overrepresented. So did Turek just lie? Did he just not check? What's going on here? I'll grant that when it comes to popular level work, animals are overrepresented compared to actual research, probably because humans tend to like things that are like themselves, and so the average human cares more about animals than plants. There's even a psychological phenomenon called plant blindness that explains that humans tend to gloss over plants and treat them more like inanimate parts of the environment than dynamic life forms. Did Turek just assume that the bias seen in pop science is also reflected in the literature?
But according to the Darwinists, plants have evolved too.
Yes, hence the millions of papers about plant evolution.
How so?
Mutation, selection, and drift, just like any other organism. I don't even understand the confusion here. Like, I get why he broadly rejects evolution, and so would reject it for plants as well as for animals, but why does he seem to think it's more implausible for plants than for animals? Are plants somehow less or more subject to mutation or drift or selection? Is there something about their morphology that just isn't influenced by genes such that natural selection can work? This seems to be a problem Frank is just making up in his head. I've never heard another creationist balk at plant evolution in a unique way or in contrast to animal evolution, as if one were much more likely than the other.
No idea.
I am very confident indeed that Turek has no idea. I can endorse that statement wholeheartedly.
Let's give you the entire quote from Dawkins now. I gave you the first sentence.
Okay, we're not going to elaborate on the whole plants can't evolve thing. Just a lie about the quantity of research on plant evolution, a statement of ignorance, and on to Dawkins. Sure, let's see what that piece of trash has to say.
In his exchange with Philip Johnson, here's the entire quote. Check this out. The reason we know for certain we are all related, including bacteria, is the universality of the genetic code and other biochemical fundamentals.
Hey, I use that exact thing as one of the things that, if it were found to not hold true, would falsify common ancestry. Neat.
My philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism is true.
What a shocker. Dawkins being so abysmal at philosophy that he thinks that a philosophical commitment itself has a truth value. Dawkins just never learned to stay in his lane, did he? One group of people that don't have to be as awful as Richard Dawkins is my subscribers. So why not subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications so that YouTube might someday let you know when I have more content. You know, if they feel like it. While you're doing that, please hit like so that YouTube can show my video to people, you know, again, when they feel like it.
But I would prefer to characterize it as a philosophical commitment to a real explanation as opposed to a complete lack of explanation, which is what you espouse. Man, he's giving away the store here, isn't he?
Wow.
I don't even know what that means. He put up evidence of common ancestry and then said that it's evidence that he's right about naturalism, although he said it in an unbelievably dumb way. And while I think it's a non sequitur, it's not like it lends any credence to intelligent design.
He's saying it's true, my philosophical commitment to materialism and reductionism. Well, if materialism is what he believes, and materialism is true, he ought not believe it. Why?
Let me guess. A very, 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 very dumb reason.
Because he can't know truth if materialism is true. Again.
Materialism being true does not stop propositions from conforming to reality. I don't even see how it could. So yes, you can believe true things, and you can have good reasons to think that they're true, whether or not materialism is true.
It's self-defeating. Go back to our quote with Crick, remember?
I don't, because I suspect that's from an earlier episode of whatever this is, and I haven't watched any of the earlier episodes. If they're all like this, but about topics I care less about, I can't imagine I will ever watch them.
When Crick said, the astonishing hypothesis is that you, your thoughts, your feelings, your dreams are just a bungle of nerve endings, basically, just molecules in motion. Well, then his thought right here is just molecules in motion. His thought about the universality of genetic code is just molecules in motion.
Yeah, and? Look, a calculator is just electrons in motion, yet if I ask it to perform arithmetic functions, it reliably gets the right answer. Nothing about the possibility that the mind reduces to material components indicates that, for this reason is incapable of coming to correct conclusions on the basis of good evidence or rationale. If the mind boils down to ions and molecules going around doing things, that's not fundamentally different to a calculator reducing down to electrons going around doing things. And just like the latter is generally reliable, so too can be the former. I'm not saying it has to be, but I see no fundamental reason why a purely physical brain cannot produce a mind capable of reliable reasoning. Further, I see no reason why an immaterial mind must be any more or less reliable than a material one. This seems to just be Turek saying, "Ha! You think you're made of matter, and I declare you a dum-dum because you do, so near. Maybe he gave an argument before, but somehow I doubt it. Further, evolution doesn't require materialism. Many non-materialists accept evolution. Sure, evolution is compatible with materialism, but it's also compatible with supernaturalism, near as I can tell.
He doesn't really have free will. He doesn't have the ability to choose.
Neither of which are necessary to believe things that are true for good reason. My calculator doesn't have freedom to choose or free will either. If anything, that makes it more accurate. Now, I wouldn't argue that a lack of choice or free will makes humans more or less accurate, but I don't think it weighs in favor of less accurate.
He doesn't have the ability to know truth.
Yeah, that's a citation needed right there.
It's just chemicals firing.
Yup.
He's ruling out intelligence beforehand. He's begging the question. He's assuming what he's trying to prove.
Not in that quote, he's not. He's just noting that common ancestry seems true, and that it's compatible with naturalism. Then he does go on to make an unjustified leap to that demonstrating the truth of naturalism, and he phrases it like an idiot, but that's not begging the question. It's also not ruling out intelligence beforehand. I'm frankly kind of amazed that Turek is somehow worse at philosophy than Dawkins is. I had rather assume that Dawkins was near the floor on that one. Good to know someone can be so much worse at it than him.
Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. And that's what he's saying right here.
Oh good, back to whining about anthropomorphization. Hey, Frank, if you watch this, I'm sorry that you hate basic human behavior so much. Maybe get a therapist rather than spouting nonsense on TV.
All right, microevolution. Microevolution. In 2004, by the way,
A tangent before even finishing a single clause in the first sentence of a new topic. That has to be some kind of record.
By the way, I just had an email exchange with Jonathan Wells yesterday. I don't know if you know Jonathan Wells. He wrote the book, Icons of Evolution. He's at the Discovery Institute.
Yeah, he's also a moronic lying piece of shit. Who the fuck cares? He's also a Mooney, so that's fun. You gotta love a cult member who got into science deliberately to destroy science.
A very, very clear thinker.
You serious?
He has a PhD in biology from UCal Berkeley.
Very little I've ever covered has made me want to hit Alt F4 on myself as much as this sentence.
I think he has another PhD from somewhere else. Anyone know where? Wells, he's got 2 PhDs. He's like Dembski. He's forgotten more than I'll ever know. Brilliant guy.
Make sure you golf clap at home for John Wells, the guy who bafflingly thinks that natural selection just isn't a thing. Also make sure you check out this video about him that I've put up in the card above.
I was emailing him because I heard him say recently there's just a couple of categories that evolutionists make, or a couple of categories into which you could place the arguments that they make.
If you want to be reductive about it, sure.
And the 2 categories he mentioned are homology, the one we just went through, and the second is microevolution.
Where do things like natural variation and endogenous retroviruses fit in? What about the universality of the genetic code or the handedness of biomolecules?
When you unpack, or when you cut through all the fog that the evolutionists try and put forth as to evidence, you can put them into those 2 categories. It's a similarity argument, or it's a micro to macro argument.
Oh, so he just thinks similarity is the same as homology, which, no, it's not, and micro to macro doesn't even make sense. The distinction between micro and macroevolution was coined by entomologist Yuri Filipchenko. He created it because he believed that while Darwinian mechanisms could explain minor changes in a species, that going from one species to another needed big macromutations that caused a large change all at once and created a new species in a single generation. Now we do know that things like that can happen. For instance, plants frequently have whole genome duplications, resulting in new species in a single generation. But it can happen in animals too. One famous example is the crayfish, crawdad, mudbug, ditchbug, freshwater lobster, mountain lobster, or yabby, depending on where you're from, Procambarus virginalis, which evolved in a single generation from its predecessor and still going strong in the wild, Procambarus phallax. But while these kinds of macromutations do happen, most speciation is simply a result of a lot of microevolution with a lack of gene flow. As populations accumulate mutations without trading genetic material back and forth, they diverge, and become more and more different. Eventually, it becomes reasonable to call them different species and macroevolution has occurred. Remember, macroevolution is just any evolution at or above the species level. If you have a few years to spare and you don't mind raising fruit flies, you can watch macroevolution happen in real time by just separating out some fruit flies and giving them different diets for a few years, and hence hundreds of generations.
That's it, basically. Okay, that's their evidence.
I still think it's a vast oversimplification, but if you want to toss everything into one of two buckets for some reason, I can't stop you, and I don't really care to.
Well, let's take a look now at the micro-argument. In 2004, you may have seen this edition. In fact, I have this edition at home.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I did see it. It's an example of Bettridge's law of headlines that says that anytime you see a journalistic headline asking a yes or no question, the answer is no. And no, this isn't a rigorous scientific law.
National Geographic came out with an entire edition, Was Darwin Wrong? That was the cover. You remember this? What conclusion do you think they made? Gee, no surprise there, right? Was Darwin wrong?
I mean, yeah, he was wrong about gemmules, blended inheritance, the age and cause of a river valley in South America, and plenty of other stuff. But he wasn't wrong about natural or sexual selection. At least, not in the broad strokes. And that's what he's remembered for. It's kind of like asking if Isaac Newton was wrong. Well, he was sure wrong about whether mercury is safe to eat. And it turns out there's way more to mechanics than he could ever have known about. But no, he was still right at classical scales about his laws of motion and universal gravitation.
Well, science doesn't say anything, scientists do. These scientists said, no, Darwin wasn't wrong. Here was their main evidence, and I'm not making this up. When you go inside the magazine, this is what you will see. This is their main evidence. Is that a bulldog?
Yes, it is. Specifically, it's an English bulldog.
Why is that their evidence, do you think? Why would they put a bulldog up there? Here's why. They're saying that dog breeding is an example of evolution.
Well, evolution is a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. Dog breeding selects various alleles and intentionally breeds those animals with them in order to increase their prevalence in a breed, which itself is a population. So yes, it is an example of evolution. The only way to say it's not is if the evolution you're talking about isn't the one that biologists are talking about when they talk about evolution.
Dog breeders can breed dogs as small as a Chihuahua and as large as a Great Dane, right?
They can get dogs bigger than that, but yes, minimally we know that they can at least do that. And we also know that this level of size variation, as well as just the existence of the size extremes, is unknown in wild wolf populations. This means that breeders didn't get to modern dogs by selecting from wolf diversity. There were unique mutations that occurred in dogs and that were spread by human breeders, or in many cases, simply by natural selection as dogs weren't at first intentionally bred. Indeed, many dogs actually don't belong to breeds, but rather land races, which is a variety of domesticated animal that results from natural adaptation to being domesticated in a particular environment, but was not intentionally bred for by humans. Some examples include the Carolina dog, the Saluki, and the Pariah dog.
They can get a lot of variation in the genetic code of dogs to get a lot of that variation there. They can get all those different types of dogs. And so what they're saying is that we can do this in a very short period of time, this breeding. We can do it in a very short period of time. So macroevolution over a long period of time can go much further. In other words, they're extrapolating from micro into macro.
Yes, because observably, macroevolution normally occurs as a result of just lots of microevolution. Saying this doesn't count is like watching someone put water into an empty Olympic swimming pool with a hose for a few minutes and then noting that the pool wasn't full when you stopped watching, and from there concluding that you can't fill Olympic-sized pools with a hose. It seems very obvious that yes, you can, and if you want to say you can't, you need more than to just say it didn't happen while you were there watching in less time than is expected for it to happen. The fact is that microevolutionary changes build up and tend towards macroevolution, just like the amount of water in the pool builds up and tends towards filling the pool. If you want to deny that pool filling or macroevolution are possible via the proposed mechanisms at this point, you need to propose a barrier.
Now, if anyone ever asks you, do you believe in evolution, what should your first question be? Hint, it's tactic 1. What do you mean by that?
Or you could just say yes and move on with your day.
What do you mean by evolution?
I usually mean that change in allele frequency in a population over time and or universal common ancestry.
because there's at least two distinctions or two different types you need to talk about. If you're talking about micro, I'm with you. Yeah, I see micro. Micro happens all the time.
That's true.
And the ability of a particular type of creature to adapt itself to its environment. Yeah, no problem. Okay?
I mean, that can be part of microevolution, but most evolution at the molecular level is dominated by drift. Neutral variation will build up in populations over time regardless of how well they're adapted to their environments. This is why neutral variation is so important in testing relatedness between lineages. Because such mutations are not under natural selection, they are free to vary, meaning that such mutations can only be caused by the patterns of descent acting neutrally. The nucleotide sequences will not converge or diverge as a result of selection, which can obscure the phylogenetic signal.
See it all the time. But if you're talking about macro, I don't think you can extrapolate from micro to macro, but they say we can.
Because they've watched it happen numerous times in real life, both in the wild and in labs. Like I keep saying, if you want to watch it yourself, there are inexpensive experiments you can do at home. Of course, your housemates or significant other might not like you running fruit fly experiments at home, but that's a you problem, not an evolution problem.
You know why we can? Because if breeding in a short period of time can do this, then macroevolution over a long period of time can do that.
Yeah, the argument is just, hey, we can see large amounts of morphological change in a relatively short time. So in a longer time, we could see more morphological change. This is just the same argument as noting that if I have an egg and then grab another egg, I now have 2 eggs. If I repeat this process, I could get any arbitrarily large number of eggs. If you want to say that's not true, you have to provide a problem for my extrapolation, like how many egg-laying animals exist and noting that eventually I'd have all the eggs, or noting that some of my eggs will rot away and not really be eggs after a certain time, meaning I'll likely reach an equilibrium. These are the kinds of barriers that we would need to say that microevolution cannot proceed to macroevolution.
Or natural selection over a long period of time can do macroevolution.
No, on its own, natural selection cannot cause macroevolution. It needs mutations to do so. The main mechanisms of evolution can't just be separated from each other and then expected to account for evolution on their own. That's like saying cake is just flour.
Here's the problem. Here's the big but.
I like big butts and I cannot lie.
But if intelligent breeding meets genetic limits, then how can non-intelligence exceed them?
That might be a problem, but I'm not aware that selective breeding has hit any genetic limits. Indeed, new breeds are created all the time as a result of mutation, such as the Sphinx cat, which is a fairly recent breed of cat that is hairless because of mutation in one kitten in the 20th century. That's whole new genetics coming into play in selective breeding. So when taken synchronically, I guess you can say that breeders might have reached some theoretical limit of the genetics of an organism with which they are working, but since evolution is fundamentally about change over time, I think looking at populations synchronically is useless in evolution, and only a diachronic picture makes sense in this context. When looking at selective breeding diachronically, it's not clear to me that there are indeed genetic limits. Genomes seem to be able to vary to any degree, although not at any rate. So to see a certain level of variation, it may take a long time.
I mean, here we are with all our intelligence. These breeders try and breed all these dogs, but they run into genetic limits. They can go small as a Chihuahua and as large as a Great Dane, but they can't go beyond those limits. There appear to be limits, and using all our intelligence, we run into limits. So why should we expect non-intelligence to exceed them?
Okay, but noting that there seem to be size limits for a particular group of animals isn't a genetic limit. It's a physical limit to the morphology of the creature. A genetic limit would mean that the genome of a creature for some reason couldn't mutate in certain ways. That's not what morphological limitations are. Evolution isn't untrue because you can't get a dog the size of Godzilla. What stops a dog from evolving into something that is extremely different and recognizably a different species, but staying within the actual physical limits imposed by just having to exist in an environment? I don't see anything.
You say, well, we just need more generations. Tried it. Done it with E. coli bacteria. 40,000 generations. There's a guy at the University of Pittsburgh, I think, that's been doing this for 25 or 30 years. What does he have now?
This is a reference to the Lenski long-term Escherichia coli experiment, and what he has now is macroevolution, because part of the definition of E. coli is its inability to metabolize citrate under aerobic conditions, but now some strains in the experiment can, meaning that they no longer meet the species definition for E. coli, and so speciation has occurred, which means macroevolution has occurred. That these strains have not been given a new binomial is just a choice made by the humans conducting the experiment.
E. coli bacteria.
Not in every case. Some of those bacteria would fail one or more of the basic tests for whether or not a bacterium is E. coli.
Tried it with fruit flies, because they have very short lifespans. Many generations. Fruit flies. What do we have now?
Artificially induced speciation, meaning macroevolution. Again, that these variations were not given a new specific designation is immaterial. Speciation by the biological species concept can be induced in a lab in fruit flies in a few years. That means that's macroevolution.
Mutant fruit flies.
Yeah, that's rather how evolution works. Noting that evolution works in an experiment about evolution isn't exactly a big win for saying evolution is wrong. It's like telling a Christian that the fact that Pontius Pilate really existed is a problem for Christianity. You might think that's a problem for Christianity, but only because you apparently don't understand Christianity.
Okay, they're still fruit flies.
Of course they are. If they weren't, then something other than evolution as we understand it occurred. Phylogeny is like an append-only ledger. If you had fruit fly entered into your ledger, you can't take it off. You can only add new entries. And if anyone looks at the ledger, fruit fly will always be there. You can't evolve so much that some of your ancestors are no longer part of your ancestry. That doesn't even make sense.
Some of them have wings coming out of their heads. They're not advantageous mutations.
Here Frank is mixing up studies in speciation with studies about mutation and genetics. The mutations he's describing were induced to use fruit flies as a model organism to uncover how genetics works. These experiments were not about speciation. Other experiments are about speciation and do not involve weird, obviously harmful mutations to fruit flies being induced. In fact, in speciation studies on fruit flies, you don't have to induce mutations at all. The natural mutation rate of the flies is plenty. I suppose I'm not surprised that Frank doesn't even know which experiments he's talking about. But I'm still disappointed.
We still have fruit flies, and we're using our intelligence to try and manipulate them, and we still can't break the genetic barriers.
All experiments are designed by intelligent agents. That doesn't mean that the phenomena observed are only the result of intelligent agents. Look at the Cavendish experiment that was used to measure the value of the gravitational constant originally in order to calculate the mass of the Earth, since the gravitational acceleration of the Earth was known. It uses the horizontal attraction of large masses suspended on a torsion bar, thereby cleverly cancelling out the otherwise overwhelming gravitational pull of the Earth. Further, in well-constructed versions of the experiment, care is taken to electrically ground and shield the apparatus and to protect it from any wind currents. That's a whole lot of intelligence needed to conduct a good Cavendish experiment. Yet, does that mean that gravity requires intelligence? I hardly see how. Creationists are all about that laboratory science until it shows they're wrong. Then they just pretend that since experiments are set up by intelligent agents, that means that experiments are also somehow demonstrate creation by an intelligent designer, even when they absolutely do no such thing. Talk about having your cake and eating it too.
Greg.
Yeah, something might be said here about the problems with even microevolution, because I think it's fair to acknowledge that microevolution happens, but when you get closer to the details themselves, there's some significant question whether even in so-called microevolution, whether or not you actually ever get any new or novel features.
Or new information.
New information.
Yeah.
That's literally what mutations are, and there is absolutely no question that mutations occur. Earlier, Greg stepped in as the voice of reason, but I guess now he's just tossing all that away to be a de facto mutation denier, which is weird, since we can measure mutations both across generations and over phylogenetically relevant timescales.
What you get is a restructuring of things, or rather an expression of things that are already there.
That's weird because until 1966, the hairless trait in Sphinx cats didn't exist. Until the early 20th century, the traits that HIV uses to infect humans instead of other apes didn't exist. Until the 1980s or so, the trait that allows the marbled crayfish to reproduce asexually didn't exist. Until the mid-20th century, nylonase producing bacteria didn't exist. Until the late 2000s, the trait of being able to metabolize citrate in an aerobic environment didn't exist in the subjects of the Lenski long-term E. coli experiment. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. We know for a fact that this is bullshit. New traits occur all the time in many lineages. It happens through mutations, and this is well understood. Greg and Frank are just denying basic reality. Also, of course, don't hold your breath for them to define what they mean by information in a way that actually lets us check if it has increased or decreased in a lineage, or if there's new information generated in any particular circumstance. Once they do that, then it will be trivially easy to show that new information does indeed arise all the time. So they'll just keep it nebulous, or at least that's my prediction.
And may already be manifest in the populations, but in such a small amount, you don't notice it.
Nope, and we can tell because in many cases, the known mutations are so advantageous that they cause a near instantaneous selective sweep, and they are immediately noticeable. I promise, the CYP plus trait wasn't subtle. Neither is HIV infecting a human. Neither is a cat that doesn't grow fur.
So when you have the famous case of the peppered moth in England,
which has never been put forth as an example of a new trait, but rather of natural selection, which can only act on existing traits. Once again, pulling a single mechanism of evolution out and complaining that on its own it doesn't explain all of evolution is dumb. Just like describing a cake as flour is dumb. Evolution is an emergent phenomenon, meaning that no one aspect of it can possibly explain everything about it. You need at least a minimum of few mechanisms to explain it all. Just mutation, just selection, or just drift won't get you there. All of them act together.
You have the melanic variety, the darker variety, and the white.
Yep, those varieties had to already exist in order for natural selection to act at all.
Those varieties always existed in the population.
No, they didn't always exist. At some point, those traits came into being via mutation. It's just that it was probably a long time before the well-known natural selection-driven microevolution.
It's just that the force of the environment through natural selection changed the relative numbers of the population.
Wait, is Greg telling us that there was a change in the frequencies of particular alleles over time as a result of natural selection? Well, guess what? That's literally evolution by natural selection. That is not all of evolution is immaterial.
It didn't create one thing into another thing.
I don't even know what that means, but it certainly was evolution by natural selection. You know, the thing Darwin was kind of known for.
So strictly speaking, there is no evolution even of a micronature going on there.
Except that, you know, Greg just literally described the occurrence of evolution by natural selection in English peppered moths. What a wild take to just describe accurately an observed and documented instance of evolution, explain how it was indeed evolution, and then say, see, there was no evolution. Greg could look at a clear blue midsummer Arizona sky and tell you it's green.
There is natural selection that's changing the relative densities of population.
Well, allele frequencies, population density is something else, but yes, that's evolution. Greg doesn't have to like it, but what he's describing is evolution. Granted, there's more to evolution than that, but what he is describing is a minimal form of evolution.
And so it gives the impression that there is an evolution to one variety and then an evolution back to the other variety.
Yeah, in the same way that putting an egg in boiling water for a few minutes gives you the impression of making a boiled egg.
When the conditions changed there in England after the Industrial Revolution. This is true with the finch's beak as well. The famous Darwin's finches that have the larger beak and the smaller beak. Again, you have no novel information that's being caused by some Darwinian mechanism.
Obviously. Darwin didn't know about genes, DNA, or mutation. Mutation is a non-Darwinian mechanism, but it's still a part of evolution, because evolution isn't Darwinism. We've moved on from Darwin a long time ago.
What you have is a change in population size.
Actually, I'm unaware of any population size studies done on peppered moths, but okay, changes in population size are not on their own evolution.
Through natural selection, certainly, but only a change in population size, not actual evolution.
That's only something you can say if you either don't know what evolution is or you're a liar. Right now, I'll be generous and say that Greg just doesn't know what evolution is.
Not introduction of novel features even on a micro level.
Yes, that requires mutation, and we have lots of examples of that too.
So the idea of microevolution we can kind of give the nod to, but even then we're giving more credit than is due given the evidence.
Exactly. Well said. That's often overlooked.
That Frank thinks that was well said tells us that he either just fundamentally does not know what evolution is, or that he is also a liar. I'm not prepared to say he's a liar, so I'll just assume that he stupidly thinks he can debunk evolution without even knowing what it is in the first place. Which, you know, isn't a great start. But hey, I think that's a good stopping point for now. He's about to change topics, or rather just dive deeper into the fact that natural selection can't produce new variation. That's enough of a new topic that I think it deserves a whole new video. And this video is already pretty long. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Benthoven, Philravara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Denny5252, Eleron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabdy Babdy, Monkey They Them, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, John Ackerman, Eta V, and Strawberry Vein. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.